There are obviously other objections beyond the due process ones to these sorts of laws, and this has become very much a partisan issue at this point. These laws have been passed in 19 states and the District of Columbia, and the only state that passed one with Republicans in control of the state government is Florida. In the wake of Parkland. So, you haven't seen that same sort of buy-in from Republicans in red states on this concept for the due process concerns. And then also there's, concerns over how broad the pool of people who can
complain, right?
Yeah, complain is, because in some states, it wasn't Colorado, I believe you don't even have to know the person personally.
If I just see an Instagram post or something, yeah.
Yeah, and so, there's obviously concerns of abuse of these sorts of orders, because even if you do have that quick ability to get into court quickly, within 48 to 72 hours, somebody that's still having the police come by to seize your guns is going to be, this is basically a form of harassment if you haven't actually done anything wrong or made any sort of threats. And so that's another serious concern that people have about these, probably one that I would imagine you share.
It needs to be a relatively narrow group of people. So members of a household, school officials, if a person is a student. There's some really interesting questions about, should this include police? And I think when push comes to shove, that's acceptable that it would include police. But yeah, a broad, wide-ranging, I don't like so-and-so on Twitter, and I know that they have guns, and then I'm going to make some, it's conceivable that can occur. Maybe it's happened. I don't know if it has occurred. It's conceivable that could occur.
I remember a case where it actually happened against a police officer who had shot a suspect, and the suspect's family member had taken out a red flag order against the officer. That's one that sticks out in my mind. Although I assume that didn't go very far.
No, I doubt it.
But that was an example that I recall. The other issue that I've heard with these sorts of policies is the idea that they are limited in their approach to solving the issue, right? All they do is require someone to give up their firearms. They don't actually, in most cases, as far as I'm aware, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, they don't actually mandate any sort of mental health intervention or treatment for the person involved. They're just kind of like, well, they're dangerous, we'll take their guns away, and then I guess hopefully they'll get things sorted out after that.
Well, there's different kinds of circumstances. So I don't think there would be a one size fits all. I wouldn't necessarily object to adding a mental health evaluation requirement, but the reality is that the on the ground reality is that once an intervention like that occurs, number one, you're on law enforcement radar. The family has intervened, and they've done so through a method that is a lot less complicated than the mental health evaluation. And so there is an opportunity. As I said, it's like hitting a pause button. Now, the next layer of it, the next layer of reform we need reform of our mental health system overall. But that is much more difficult to do in the context. If you're saying my solution to mass shootings, where we repeatedly have these red flags, is an overhaul of our mental health system, that's so big and so complex. It's not really an immediate response to a public safety issue. Whereas the red flag laws are a response to a public safety issue, and they're also traditional. They connect with the kind of gun control that the gun rights community has been much more supportive of than others, and that is gun control that is tied to human behavior. Okay, right. So what is denying felonies a felon from possessing a firearm? What is that? That's tied to what he did, right? What is it that, somebody's convicted of a crime of domestic violence? That's tied to what you did. What is it when you're talking about mental, someone who's been involuntarily committed? It's tied to something that is an illness or that is besetting a person. When you tie gun control away from behavior and towards firearms, the reality is often what you're doing is you're just inhibiting the law-abiding citizen from accessing the weapon while you're doing really nothing at all to the criminal class. Because we know that the criminal class, by and large, possesses and obtains guns unlawfully. So we know that there's very little, if you're not deterred by felon in possession rules, if you're not deterred by straw purchaser prohibitions, how much of an extra deterrent is it to say, well, now you have to get a background check at a gun show, right? How much of an extra deterrent? If you have how many millions of AR-15s in circulation? How many
like
tens of millions of what's more accurately called standard capacity magazines in circulation? What you're doing when a lot of these weapon and magazine of weapons that are commonly used for a lawful purpose, what you're doing with those kinds of restrictions is you're putting something that's not even really a speed bump in the way of the criminal, but you're putting a bar in the way of the law-abiding citizen. And that's where you sort of have a fundamental underlying problem with those kinds of gun control regulations. Whereas the red flag law, it's tied to your behavior. It's tied to what you've been doing. And that makes it, in my mind, much more just. If I have completely complied with the law and I want a Glock for self-protection, and I'm in a state where it's going to have a very restricted capacity magazine, and the foreseeable criminal who would come in my home is not going to have they're going to have a standard capacity magazine, all the law has done is hurt me. But if I have a Glock and I'm engaged in suicidal ideation or engaged in ideation that is tied to, murderous ideation, then I have done something. I have engaged in behavior that is justly alarming. And an adult who owns a gun should know better. This is not asking too much of people. This is not asking too much of people to not say, don't threaten to shoot up your school. That's not asking too much. Don't threaten to commit suicide. That's not asking too much. And so it's a reasonable request to people, akin to sort of saying the standard gun safety rules that, don't point at something you don't want to shoot. Don't put your finger on the trigger until you're going to shoot. I mean, treat every gun as if it's loaded. Don't engage in suicidal ideation. Don't threaten to shoot up a school. I mean, these things should be, pretty, for a responsible adult gun owner, this should be basic stuff.